The next global power struggle is not happening in Europe, the Middle East, or even in the South China Sea. It is happening in Africa, a continent of 1.5 billion people, rich in resources, young in population, and rapidly industrializing. And in 2026, two of the world's biggest superpowers are now competing openly to shape its future, the United States and China. But this is not a traditional rivalry. This is not just diplomacy. This is an economic takeover battle. And the latest trigger, a zero-tariff deal, has officially escalated the competition into a new phase. Africa, the new center of global power. For decades, Africa was treated as a developing region in global politics, but that narrative is now outdated. Africa today represents one of the fastest-growing populations on Earth, a rapidly expanding consumer market, a massive source of critical minerals, a future manufacturing hub, and a key geopolitical voting bloc in global institutions. By 2050, Africa's population is expected to reach nearly 2.5 billion. That means 1 in every 4 people on Earth could be African, and whoever builds influence there first gains long-term global leverage. The new trigger, China's zero-tariff strategy. In 2026, China made a bold economic move. It expanded a zero-tariff policy covering 53 African countries, giving them duty-free access to its massive domestic market. This means African exports, from agriculture to minerals to manufactured goods, can enter China without import taxes. On paper, this sounds like simple trade cooperation, but in reality, it is a strategic shift in global power dynamics. Because China is effectively saying, we will open our market to Africa while securing long-term economic partnerships in return. Why this move is so powerful? This zero-tariff strategy is not just about trade, it is about influence. Because when a country gives access to its market, it gains supply chain dependence, political alignment, infrastructure cooperation, long-term trade loyalty. China already became Africa's largest trading partner years ago. Now it is deepening that relationship at an even faster pace. And it is doing so at the exact moment the United States is rethinking its global trade strategy. The United States enters the competition. While China expands tariff-free access, the United States is also reshaping its Africa strategy. But in a very different way. Instead of blanket access, Washington focuses on selective trade agreements, strategic partnerships, security cooperation, private sector investment, conditional aid programs. Programs like AGOA African Growth and Opportunity Act have provided duty-free access for certain African exports, but with strict eligibility requirements tied to governance and policy alignment. So while China is expanding open market access, the U.S. is focusing on targeted influence through policy and conditions. This creates a completely different style of competition. Two competing systems. At this stage, the rivalry is no longer just economic, it is ideological in structure. China's model, open market access, infrastructure financing, resource for investment deals, long-term trade integration. China often builds roads, ports, railways, and industrial zones in exchange for long-term economic partnerships. United States model, private investment-led growth, trade agreements with conditions, security alliances, institutional reform support. Both systems are trying to achieve the same goal, influence Africa's economic future. But they use completely different strategies. The real battlefield, resources and supply chains. Africa is not just important because of population, it is important because of resources. The continent holds massive reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, gold, rare earth materials, oil, and natural gas. These resources are essential for electric vehicles, AI hardware, defense systems, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing. Without Africa, global supply chains become unstable, and that makes Africa one of the most strategically important regions in the world. China's advantage, speed and infrastructure. China's biggest strength in Africa is execution speed. Over the past 2 decades, China has built highways and rail networks, developed major ports, financed industrial zones, expanded telecom infrastructure, provided large-scale loans and investments. This infrastructure-first approach creates long-term dependency networks. Because once a country's logistics system is built by one partner, switching becomes extremely difficult. America's advantage, finance and technology. The United States has a different type of power. Instead of infrastructure dominance, it relies on global financial systems, technology companies, dollar-based trade influence, private investment networks, military partnerships. This allows the U.S. to influence Africa through banking systems, startup ecosystems, defense cooperation, digital platforms. It is a more indirect form of influence, but still powerful. The hidden competition, young population power. Africa's population is extremely young. The median age in many countries is under 20. This means Africa will become the world's largest labor force, a massive consumer market, a future tech adoption hub. So both China and the U.S. are competing not just for today's Africa, but for the next 50 years of economic influence. Trade war ripple effects. Global tensions between the U.S. and China are also affecting Africa indirectly. As trade barriers rise between the two superpowers, African countries become alternative partners for manufacturing and exports. China increases exports, and investment flows into Africa to offset Western restrictions. Meanwhile, the U.S. tries to ensure Africa does not become overly dependent on Chinese infrastructure and financing. So Africa becomes a strategic balancing point in global trade. The debt and dependency debate. One of the most controversial aspects of China's Africa strategy is debt financing. Many African countries have taken large infrastructure loans from Chinese institutions. Supporters say this accelerates development. Critics argue it creates long-term dependency. At the same time, Western financial institutions also provide loans and aid with their own conditions. So the real debate is not about who invests more, but who shapes long-term economic decisions. The technology layer, Digital Africa. The competition is no longer limited to roads and minerals. It is also digital. China is expanding telecom infrastructure, smart city systems, digital payment platforms, surveillance technology exports. The U.S. is expanding cloud services, fintech ecosystems, internet platforms, startup investment networks. The future of Africa may be determined by which digital ecosystem becomes dominant. The geopolitical reality. Africa today is not a passive region. It is an active participant in global strategy. African governments are increasingly negotiating with multiple superpowers, diversifying partnerships, demanding better trade terms, leveraging competition for better deals. This means Africa is no longer being controlled by one power. It is becoming a contested strategic zone. The bigger picture, a new global order. What is happening in Africa reflects a larger global shift. We are moving away from a single global economic system toward competing economic spheres of influence. China builds one network. The U.S. builds another. Africa sits in the middle, and whichever system gains stronger alignment will shape global economics for decades. The battle for Africa is not a short-term trade dispute. It is a long-term struggle for influence over resources, markets, infrastructure, technology, population growth, and geopolitical alignment. China's zero-tariff strategy signals aggressive economic expansion. The United States responds with strategic partnerships and financial influence. And Africa stands at the center of it all. A continent once seen as distant from global power is now one of the most important arenas in the world. Because the future of global dominance may not be decided in Washington or Beijing, but in Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Addis Ababa. The competition for Africa has officially entered a new phase, with China expanding zero-tariff access and the U.S. strengthening strategic partnerships. The race for influence over 1.5 billion people is accelerating fast. This is no longer just trade, it's a long-term struggle for global power and economic control. And what happens in Africa over the next decade could reshape the entire world order. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep dives into the biggest global power shifts happening right now.